Okay, 1, 2. On that screen. Hello, hello, welcome to all. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Laura Reckford, Executive Director of the Falmouth Art Center. Thank you for joining the Falmouth Art Center's book club for this special presentation today. People are still coming into the session, so I'll be letting them in as I'm giving an introduction here. Our special presentation today with Faith Mitchell about her book, Emma's Postcard Album, Black Lives in the Early 20th Century. A few housekeeping items before we begin. This meeting is being recorded. There are several people who told me they wanted to attend but couldn't make it, so we are recording it. And but please keep yourself on mute during the talk. If you are not muted and there's some noise coming from your Zoom box, don't be surprised if we mute you. Still letting people in. I'm so glad so many people were timely today about the talk. If you have a question during the presentation, if you can put it in the chat and we'll answer it during the Q&A portion of the presentation, which will be after the PowerPoint. And just as an introduction, the Falmouth Art Center's book club is always free and open to all. Unlike most book clubs, we actually don't require or even expect that people have read the book before the meeting. The meeting is really an opportunity to learn about the book, and in many cases, hear directly from the author about the book. So for those who are off Cape and have never been to the Falmouth Art Center, we do have a number of new people at this session. The Falmouth Art Center is a community art center located in Falmouth, Massachusetts on Cape Cod. We were founded in 1966, way back then. We do offer classes and workshops for all ages and abilities in painting, weaving, ceramics, and more. And we do have 3 galleries of local art that change monthly for a total of more than 36 shows a year. There's always something new to see here, so we hope you stop in. Over the last few years, since starting our Falmouth Art Center Book Club, we've been having these sessions every few months. We've had 14 book club sessions, with most of them featuring the author of the book. And including today's talk, we've had almost 200 people attending one or more of the book discussions. So today we are in for a treat. I am so pleased to introduce Dr. Faith Mitchell, the author of Emma's Postcard Album, Black Lives in the Early 20th Century. Dr. Mitchell is a medical anthropologist whose career has bridged research, philanthropy, and social and health policy. In addition to numerous policy-related publications, she is author of Hoodoo Medicine, Gula Herbal Remedies, and the Book of Secrets, Part 1. She is an Institute Fellow at the Urban Institute, and she and her husband live in Northern Virginia. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Faith Mitchell.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks everybody for joining us today. And special thanks to Elise Alexander for introducing me to Robin Miller, and Robin introduced me to Laura, and it's great to see both of, I see Robin's face, I saw Elise's name, so glad that you could be on today. I was saying to Laura that when we first set up this talk, it was summertime, it was like 80 degrees, and February seemed like it was a million years away, and here we are. So, we're going to run through some slides, and I will talk about my book, Emma's Postcard Album, and talk some about what inspired me to write it and some of the content of the book. I'm really looking forward to your questions. So once we complete the slides, there should be about 15 minutes for Q&A, and I always enjoy the back and forth. wish I could be with you in person, but then there might not be as many people given the weather and where people live. So really appreciate having this Zoom platform to speak from. I think Laura will put the first slide up. There it is. Okay. All right. So actually, Laura, you can go to the next slide now. So where this whole story started is about 20 years ago. After my mother died, she had a trunk that she never let me go through when she was alive. Maybe some of you have been in a similar situation, but after she died, I found the key and I was going through it. And one of the things that was right at the top was this very modest album that you see on the left. It's just like a cardboard album. And when I opened it up, there were all of these postcards in it. There were about 170 cards, and I ended up putting them in a notebook that you can see on the right-hand side. Some of them had never been mailed. They were in pristine condition, and then others had been mailed to my grandmother, Emma Crawford, the woman that the book is named for. Sometimes the cards had been sent to my grandmother's home address in Lincoln University, Pennsylvania, and sometimes it would be Emma Crawford, care of, and then the name of another family. So I started to wonder about the backstory, like who was writing my grandmother, who were the people she received the cards from, in other words, why was she moving from place to place? And that's really where the book got started, just asking myself those questions and wanting to know the answers, and then wondering if there was a bigger story there that other people might be interested in. One of the things I did was I looked to see if anybody else had written about postcard correspondence, and I actually couldn't find any examples. I ultimately learned from a person who writes about postcards that even though there are lots of books about postcards themselves, like postcards of France or postcards of buildings, or postcards as representative of people's ideas about foreign countries and so forth. Collections of postcard correspondence are actually much rarer. So the idea that I had of writing a book about postcards and weaving a bigger story into it was really breaking new ground. And I decided, without really having a prototype to work with, but I decided that I would use the card not only to tell my grandmother's story, but also the bigger story about the Black people during a particular period. And the period I picked was 1906 to 1910. The cards I have actually, 1906 is about the earliest card, when my grandmother was 17, but I have cards going until about 1916, but I just picked a kind of convenient period and made that the focus of the book. And as an anthropologist, it was my training and also my instinct to try to think about these cards and the texts that were on them in a larger context of culture and community. Next slide, Laura. So here are some of the cards my grandmother collected just to get us started, and you can see that they're really beautiful. So as I said, the book starts in 1906. This was a time there was no radio, there was no TV, of course. Very few people had telephones. Most people never moved from the small towns or villages where they lived. The country was still mostly rural. And so you can imagine what a delight receiving a card would be for my grandmother or for all the other people who were getting postcards during that period. It's what we now call the golden age of postcards, because the cards were mostly designed in Europe by these very expert lithographers. They were designed and printed in Europe, and they were designed to delight the eye of viewers. And postcard collecting was a national craze during this period. So they were readily available, even in these small towns and in cities, of course. And they're really just beautiful cards. And because the album that I showed you had not been opened, I don't think, in decades, the cards in it were in just really beautiful condition. And you can see that because the colors are bright, and the press that published the book did a beautiful job. If any of you have purchased the book, you'll know what I'm talking about. They did a beautiful job of reproducing them so that we today can re-experience just the artistry of the cards of that period. Next slide. When the book starts, it's 1906. And as I mentioned, my grandmother was 17. There she is on the left, right about the time that she finished high school. And the book ends in 1910 when she was 21 years old, just before she stopped working and transitioned to motherhood. Her home base was the village outside Lincoln University in Chester County, Pennsylvania. So Lincoln University was the first institution for higher education of Black men in the United States, in fact, in the world. Today it's co-ed. And there, on the outskirts of the university, there's a small Black community, and that is where my grandmother grew up. And altogether, you can see she was born in 1889 and she lived until 1974. So she had a nice long life. She lived her entire life right there in Lincoln University, Pennsylvania. And I won't talk about it so much today, but her family had long roots in Pennsylvania. I have actually tracked them all the way back to the colonial era. So what I learned from tracking, who was sending my grandmother cards and where she was living when she received them, the places where, as I was mentioning to you, it would be like care of this and care of that. So it turned out she was working in various households in Chester County, also on the main line of Philadelphia and in New Jersey. So she was getting cards at the homes of her employers. The households ranged from well-established Quaker families in Chester County to Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of Princeton University at the time that she was working with him. And during this whole period, she was sending and receiving cards from friends, boyfriends, other suitors, and above all, her older brother, Maris, who played tuba and baritone horn in the 1900s and 1910s with Richards and Pringle's minstrel show. And we'll come back to him in a little bit. Next slide. So this slide shows you all the places that she received cards from. All of the cards from outside Pennsylvania were mailed by her brother, the one who was traveling with the minstrel shows, and you can use them to track the route of his travels with the show. And I've been able to go back with historical newspapers and find articles that were written about the minstrel troupe as they traveled throughout the country. The period of my book, 1906 to 1910, was really kind of the waning edge of minstrelsy, which had been the dominant musical form in the United States for decades. And minstrels were not playing in big cities so much at this point, but in smaller towns and out west and in the South. And you get a sense of that from looking at the map, although they were also playing in Los Angeles and San Francisco. And then on the East Coast, you can see a big cluster of cards. Those were cards that she got from relatives or from friends who were themselves like in domestic service, living in various places and sending cards back to her. Thanks to the internet and Ancestry.com in particular, I was able to get a lot of information about her employers and friends online. And then I also drew on oral history that had been passed down by my mother and some archival research at the Chester County Historical Society. My mother raised me with all kinds of stories about her family. So if I say that my book started with finding the postcards, really it started decades before that, just from hearing my mother's stories and always wanting to do more research on her family and document some of their stories. So the period in which this book takes place was the height of Jim Crow. Some people have called it the nadir of Black history, nadir as in lowest point, because even in northern communities like Chester County, Pennsylvania, there was racial segregation and there were very few occupational opportunities for the Black population. Segregation was the rule throughout the United States. And it was a time when the country as a whole was advancing economically and industrially, but Black Americans were relentlessly excluded from taking advantage of these developments. Next slide. So in the context of that exclusion and the Jim Crow, you had Black leaders trying to figure out what's the way forward for Black people. And the two big public faces of the kind of discussions within the Black community about what to do were Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. This quote that you see on this slide here is probably Booker T. Washington's most famous statement, in which he said, in all things that are purely social, the races can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand, in all things essential to mutual progress. In other words, he was saying the races don't have to, live together or socialize together, but somehow he felt that we could work together to advance the country. So he was essentially saying segregation is okay. He did not challenge segregation. And because he didn't challenge it, Booker T. Washington was extremely popular among white philanthropists who helped him build Tuskegee Institute, for instance, and invested in him in other ways. He favored vocational education, meaning teaching Black people how to work the land and how to do manual trades. And he did not believe in challenging discrimination in any way. The opposing view, next slide, Laura. The opposing view was W.E.B. Du Bois, who advocated for higher education and was a co-founder of the Niagara movement that paved the way for the civil rights movement. The Niagara movement eventually led to the establishment of the NAACP that we're all familiar with. The period of my book is the precise time when he wrote his famous line, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." So whereas Booker T. Washington is saying, let's not challenge the color line, W.B. Du Bois is saying, you absolutely have to challenge the color line. Interestingly, there were these political differences between W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, but something they all agreed on was the importance of respectability, how you carry yourself, how you speak, how you present yourself in public. And this was something that was very much reflected in Emma's upbringing. So as I was writing the book, I was thinking these kind of political storms were going on within the Black community, kind of outside of the house, but within the house, there was this, as I said, this emphasis on personal respectability. The family also stressed education and made sure that Emma had a high school education, even though there were essentially no options for her in terms of employment other than doing domestic work. I want to switch now a bit to the imagery of the age so you can get a feel for the kind of visual context of the postcards. Next slide, Laura. So as I mentioned, it was a time of Jim Crow and overt racism, and this racism was reflected in the visual imagery. So this postcard that's on the left is called Darktown Doctors, and it's a typical racist postcard. It's actually one of a series, but there was only one card like this in Emma's collection. And if you look closely, you can see that it shows three would-be doctors preparing to operate on a terrified patient under the watchful eye of this sort of glowering mammy type figure. And the doctors have chloroform, kitchen knives, a hatchet, a saw, a wrench. That's supposed to be part of the humor that they call themselves doctors, but they have these crude implements. And then the poor patient, the little boy, is lying in bed and he's expressing kind of clownish fear about what's going to come next. And images that showed Black people in demeaning and supposedly humorous ways were commonplace in those days. And similarly, on the right, you can see some sheet music, Pickaninny Mine, Come Hide Away. Words like Pickaninny and coon, were also commonplace and used to sell products, for sheet music, on posters, kind of you name it. And even worse, in terms of visual imagery, were the fact that lynching was still common in those days, and photographers would make postcards of lynched Black men and women. I won't show you an example of that because it's so horrifying, but they would show the body dangling from the tree and the crowds that were like laughing and kind of celebrating the lynching. And those cards were widely circulated until the post office cracked down on them in about 1910, at which point they just went underground, but they couldn't be sent through the mail anymore. So interestingly, there is only one racist card in Emma's collection, even though these cards were ubiquitous, and it's the one on the left. And I think that she must have told people, don't send me this stuff. Even if you think this card is funny, don't send it to me. And so instead of cards like this one, like Darktown Doctors, you have the beautiful cards like the ones that were on the slide earlier. Next slide, Laura. And then here's a few more examples of the kinds of cards that are in the book and the kinds of cards that she collected. So they are, very positive and pleasant images. The one on the bottom is a bird's eye view of Atlantic City. And then you can see literally a little swallow, and the one in the middle is a Valentine. So as I said, I think that was a deliberate decision on her part, because the negative racial cards would have been, they were everywhere, and she wasn't buying into them. Next slide, please. So a good share of the cards in her collection, as I mentioned, were from her older brother, Maris, who called himself Mike Ford. He played the tuba and baritone horn in the 1900s and 1910s with the Richards and Pringles Georgia Minstrels, who were a wildly popular all-Black company that was founded in the early 1880s by two white men, Orrin Richards and Charles Pringle. So thinking about him as someone traveling with the minstrel shows gave me an opportunity to really dig into that topic, minstrelsy, and to kind of just get a better understanding of what was he doing and why, and why, their travels through the country. And, as we all know, minstrelsy is a complicated topic. It taps right into a lot of America's racism and cultural contradictions. On the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, it was this enormously popular form of musical entertainment that dominated American popular culture from the 1840s until the 1910s. Like, I didn't realize until I started the research how dominant it had been for so long. But more than half of the 19th century, and then bleeding into the early 20th century. And, to our eyes, what we know most about minstrelsy was the fact that it relied on so many racial stereotypes for entertainment value. The mammy, and they had the kind of the coon, they called him the coon, who was shuffling around and was stupid, and pickaninny that you saw in the sheet music. Pickaninny was also in minstrelsy. What I didn't know until I started to do the research was also, in addition to the stereotype, in addition to the negativity, the negative imagery, minstrelsy was also a major form of employment for Black singers, dancers, acrobats, musicians, comedians. So it was like a double-edged sword. On the one hand, their work promoted some of these very insidious stereotypes, but on the other hand, not only were people able to make money, they were able to travel, which was also not something Black people had been able to do previously. And they were able to develop musical forms that ended up influencing American music throughout the 20th century. And not just American music, because these minstrel shows traveled internationally as well. So understanding that dimension of minstrelsy, I could see why Emma's brother might want to be engaged in it, because for one thing, it was a better alternative than working in somebody's house or working in the fields. It was this opportunity to get out and to see the rest of the country and to jam with other, good musicians and just to see what life was like outside of the small towns that people were born in. And, as I said, minstrelsy was the incubator for many of the artistic forms throughout the century, but we also are dealing with some of the racial stereotypes that came out of it to this very day. Next slide. So here's just some examples of cards that Emma's brother sent her from the road. Some of these little towns at the time when he was visiting them were just tiny, which gives you a feel for the kind of the reach that minstrelsy had throughout the country, big cities, small towns, and the way in which, as I was saying, the stereotypes that were part of it were carried into, the most remote corners of the country. For instance, on the upper right, you see a picture of a buffalo that he sent from Harlem, Montana. And at the time, Harlem had a population of 800. So I can imagine probably all 800 of them were at the minstrel show, tiny town like that, with very few opportunities for entertainment. The one that's below that is a card that he sent her about a year after the San Francisco earthquake. It's actually a photograph, a very dramatic photograph showing the fire that followed the earthquake. The one on the lower left is Los Angeles, and I don't know if you can see this on the screen, but it's an interesting depiction, of a city in transition, because you can see a trolley. There are actually a few cars. There are horses, so you get that sense of a technology in transition in this first decade of the 20th century. And then the last one at the top is a little burro from a tiny place in Arizona that the band traveled to. Something I want to point out is the fact you can see that he, in 3 of the postcards, her brother has written on the front of the card, the law that's until 1907, people had to write on the front of the card, and what went on the back was only the address and the postage. And then after 1907, you could write on the back of the card as well. But I noticed that her brother continued to write on the front. I think he had just gotten used to it. But given the fact that people had to write on the front, they often couldn't write very much. And so it might just be a sentence or two. And in that respect, these postcards are reminiscent of today's tweets. They're just little snapshots of people's thoughts or feelings. You didn't have enough space to do a whole lot of correspondence. And that was part of my challenge, was taking those little statements and expressions and then seeing, well, what does that tell me about the person who sent it? Or what can I learn from that? Sometimes people would go into a little bit of detail about things that they had done, for instance. Or sometimes it was just kind of, hey, thinking of you. Next slide. So one of the last places where Emma worked was for Woodrow Wilson when he was president of Princeton University. This was in 1910, and he was, in fact, elected governor of New Jersey while she was working for him. And then he became US president in 1913. So this was a job that started with promise, because instead of taking care of somebody's kids, Emma was apprenticed to Woodrow Wilson's chef. And she was really looking forward, I think, to getting a new level of skills. And you can get a sense of her excitement from what she wrote, as you see on the front of the card. This is the house where we are working. I guess you can imagine how large it is. This is Prospect House, which is no longer the president's residence, but it's still right there on Princeton's campus. But things did not turn out well. And this was one of the stories that my mother told me, because it's not something that would appear in print anywhere else. But Woodrow Wilson was from Virginia. He was a Southern racist, and his daughters treated Emma badly. The story I heard was that when she received letters from family members, they would burn the letters up. When she got postcards, they would, destroy some of them, so they were maybe jealous, who knows, but disconnecting her from her loved ones. And she just couldn't deal with it. And so she left in the fall of 1910 and returned to Pennsylvania. So the interesting thing is that I told my daughter this story about when my daughter went to Princeton, and I told her, your great grandmother worked here, but it didn't turn out so well. And, she had a bad experience. Well, my daughter, Alexis, we call her Lex, had an opportunity to buy a brick at Princeton, and she dedicated that brick to her great grandmother, which was wonderful. But even more than that, Lex is now teaching at Princeton. She teaches in the art department. And so it feels like kind of like the arc of justice swinging in the right direction. And, you think, could Emma ever have imagined that one of her descendants would be on the faculty of what at the time that when Emma was there, it was an all-white, all-male university. And now you have Lex there. So it feels we're really proud of that. Next slide. So I want to leave you with this question, because lots of people, when I've talked about my book, lots of people have talked about, I have a pile of photographs, or I have a pile of postcards, and I've been wondering what to do with them. And so I'm just going to leave you with this prompt for when you look at those memorabilia that you perhaps collected yourself or inherited from a family member, that, just realizing that I think every physical object really has a story that's connected with it. And, it meant something to somebody, whether it was you or someone else who gave it to you, or someone you had inherited it from. And that it's just interesting. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed researching this book because, as you can see, it led me in so many different kind of pathways and byways, and very much enlarged my understanding, not only of my grandmother's life, but of her times and of the challenges that she was up against. Produced great gratitude to me, especially for her commitment to education. She eventually she married a student from Lincoln University. They had 12 children. They made sure that all of their children finished high school, which was actually a first for that community, because most of the Black kids dropped out of school and went into domestic service. And almost all of the 12 also attended college. So it was just a major, Emma sort of oversaw just a major change in the fortunes of the family, just by the values that she expressed, that she'd learned from her own mother and that she expressed with her children. Oh, next slide, Laura. So I want to thank you for coming, and look forward to your questions and comments. And if you ever need to find me on the internet or reach me, my website is drfaithmitchell.com, and there's a form there that you can use to contact me. I also have an events page that tells you about future times when I'll be speaking. And then there's some information there about the books that I've written that Laura mentioned earlier.
And we're back. That was incredibly fascinating. Thank you so much. That was amazing. So I know we'll have a bunch of questions here. I think we have two questions to start with. So I will go ahead and read those out, or sometimes there's just comments, but I think this is a comment about the story about Princeton. What a wonderful outcome, the arc of justice for sure. And then, oops, too quickly here. Here is The next one is, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I really enjoyed your book. Not only is it beautifully put together, but also resonated with my own family experience. And that's from Claudia, who's part of our book club organizing committee. And next question or comment. So very interesting. Thank you. And then we have the first one that is a question. What kind of art does your daughter Alexis do?
Thank you for asking. She is really multimedia. She does painting and she sculpts. She has an MFA in sculpture from Yale. She also makes videos. You can see what I'm saying is multimedia. And I'll give you an example. So last year she did a video kind of installation that's called Carnelian, like the color. It was at MIT about a year ago this time. And for it, she had three singers who she wrote the script. I guess there was a spoken part and a singing part, but she hired them and she trained them. And then what made it artistic was that she then videotaped it or recorded it, and they were on three different screens. So it was like theater in the round, with this very interesting, almost like a little operetta that she had written that was about the end of the world, but it wasn't gloomy. This was the interesting thing. It was actually kind of funny, and it was written up in the New York Times. And the reviewer made that same point that, gee, they're singing about the end of the world, but yet it's kind of upbeat at the same time. Then later in the year, she did it live. She took it on the road, and they performed in Maine, and they performed in Philadelphia, and they did a version of it in New York City. So it's kind of hard to capture what she does, but she brings all of her skills together into these performances. And now she's gotten interested in actually kind of pursuing the operatic element of it. And she has some opportunities that we still can't talk about openly because they haven't been announced yet. But she's really just exploring, all of her abilities and bringing them together in these very interesting ways. She finds, I would say, that doing things live, like theater, is more engaging to her than paintings, even though she's a good painter, because she likes the interaction with people. So that's a long answer, but thanks for asking. But she teaches drawing at Princeton.
She sounds absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And that questioner also said, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And on to the next question. We weren't able to read the book. Is the book factual with more information based on the content of the cards, or is it fictional?
No, it's all factual.
That's
So what the
factual.
book does is it really uses the postcards as the starting point. So to talk not only about Emma, but also her times. So for instance, one chapter is looking at employment. So it's looking at the different people that she worked for, the kind of work she did, but then also what were the opportunities for young Black women at that period, and what options did she have? How much money did they make? So that you get a kind of a feeling for not only who she was, but how she was representative of young Black women at that time. And there's another chapter that just does the history of the family. As I mentioned in passing, they go back to colonial Pennsylvania, actually, and that part is all my own genealogical research. So it's just, it has photographs, and it's sort of telling the story of what people did at different periods of time in Pennsylvania. But it's all factual, no fiction at all.
And I would add that's really a work of scholarship, but it just completely fascinating. And that questioner, whoops, I just lost the question. Also asked, whoops, okay. Okay, There's quite a lot of questions coming in. That questioner also asked, are there other historically informed stories you can share? Very interesting.
Mhm. Oh gosh, lots of them. Let's see, historically informed stories, meaning about related to the book? Well, I don't
Yes,
know
I
if the
think they
person
mean
wants to speak up.
related to the book, I think, where you told several things related to the book, and are there others that jump out at you that you could share?
Let me think about that.
Maybe
There's so
something
many.
related to,
They're in my head, but
yeah.
one of the, I can tell some stories. One of the things that interested me, okay, and this relates to some stories, is I mentioned how my grandmother, the emphasis on education in the family. And so one of the things that really interested me, this is just doing the genealogical research on the family, was just how important that theme of education was, because they, as I said, they were living in Pennsylvania, which had a tiny Black minority at that time. This was before, really before the Great Migration, which was more like 1915, when you had more blacks coming up to the north from the south. Excuse me. And so one of the things I learned was, hold on one sec. That, even though these families were free, they weren't enslaved, they were really kind of limited in their freedom. For example, they weren't guaranteed an education, even though technically the schools were integrated. So the Black community really had to take care of itself. And they had, their churches, and often the schools were connected with the churches. And for instance, Emma's grandmother, who was born in 1848, so born like 12 years before the Civil War, lived in Lancaster County, which is the next county over from Chester County. She attended a school that taught them, was like classically oriented. She learned Latin, which my mother was always telling me about, that your great grandmother knew Latin, and they studied math and they studied English. And it's really kind of amazing if you think, to me, about this small Black community. Here, not only did my great grandmother get a chance to attend school, so which reflects a focus on education, but that also the school that she attended had such kind of lofty aims as teaching Latin and so forth. I mean, it just showed that the community really wanted to meet the same standard that white schools did, even though they had so much less money to spend and they probably didn't have much support from the broader community, but that was something that mattered to them. And it absolutely made a difference, I think, in terms of the kind of advantages that they were able to carve for themselves socially. Now, my great grandmother, despite her, Latin and her classical education, she had the same limited occupational options as my grandmother. She was working in people's families, taking care of their kids. I imagine that she was as educated as some of the women she worked for, or more educated than they were, which was, an unfortunate part of the situation. But nonetheless, even though she had not been able to take advantage of her education, she made sure that Emma was educated. And then, as I was saying at the end, Emma absolutely made sure that her children were educated. And in the 20th century, her children were finally, the opportunities began to open up. And like for my mother, who was a teacher, and her sisters were teachers, and one of her brothers was a doctor, they were really able to draw on that legacy of education and use it to their advantage in a way that Emma hadn't been able to, or her mother hadn't been able to. Another story that comes to mind, although I don't have it doesn't have I'm still doing research on it, is that this didn't apply to Emma so much, but actually her mother, the one I just mentioned with the classical education, my great-grandmother, and Emma's grandmother, who was named Mariah. These women were believed to have like magical powers. And the reason I say I'm doing more research on it is I don't know if all Black women were thought to have magical powers of some sort, or if those women in particular showed some kind of proclivity. But for instance, Emma's grandmother, the one who was named Mariah, according to my mother, was routinely called on by some of the local farmers if they felt, who also believed in witchcraft and things, if they felt that they had been hexed in some way. There was this farmer who thought he had a poltergeist, and he brought in Emma's grandmother, and Emma's grandmother successfully got rid of the poltergeist. That's one of the stories that I heard many times as a child. And Emma's own mother was called on to help some farmer who felt that somebody had put some kind of hex on his animals, and she did some stuff, had to do some stuff on the door sill, and then that was apparently a successful process. And then there was another relative who was my mother's great aunt, who used to read tea leaves. So I have actually been going back through the newspapers of that time, trying to see, like, do people, is there anything sort of anecdotal about this? Like, as I was saying, the question in my mind is, did the white farmers think that any Black woman had magical powers, or was it, these specific women that were part of my history? I don't know. And one of the problems is that the newspapers of that time actually talk very little about Black, hold on. Sorry. The newspapers at the time actually don't offer a lot of good coverage of the Black community. So even though you know that the community is there, they hardly appear. And so it makes it really hard to get any kind of evidence.
We do have a couple of questions asking, I think we were all interested when you were talking about your daughter, if she has a website, or can you give us her full name so we can look her up at what she's working on and her exhibits and
Oh, yeah. Thanks. I'm really thrilled. She'll be thrilled to hear about your interest. So her given name is Alexis Brown, but her website, we always called her Lex. And so she uses that as her art name, so to speak. So if you go to lexbrown.com, LEXBROWN.com, she has a great website that she designed, and it has all the information about her. It has her CV, it has information about Carnelian, the one that I mentioned, her show from last year and previous shows. So you'll get a good feel for what she's been up to. She's really quite an amazing young woman. She was a Harvard Fellow for a couple of years, and now, as I said, she's teaching at Princeton and continuing to do her art. Yes, thank you, Amy. LexBrown.com. That's it.
Great. And so another comment, thank you for the wonderful book. Certainly so much to think about. Another comment, this is a fascinating story. Thank you for sharing. Did you face any difficulties with research or family reactions?
Lots of difficulties with research, not with family reactions. I think the family was thrilled to see their history preserved and further researched and shared with the world. I think no one in the family has objected in any way, but the research challenges were real because actually, as I was just mentioning, I turned a lot to documents of that time. So I was pouring through newspapers and other kinds of historical writings. And you have a couple of challenges. So one is that there's I would say historically there's much more written about Black Americans in and from the South, and not surprisingly, because that's where like 95% of the Black population lived. So if you're looking at like the Black population in Pennsylvania, and especially if you're looking kind of at the time, like what are they saying in 1860 about the Black population, or what are they saying in 1900? There just really isn't that much. So I spent just hours and hours and hours combing through, sources from that period, just trying to get a feel for what was going on. And the other challenge of not only isn't there's not much there, and what is there is often patronizing or racist, so then you're having to sort of filter through that as well to try to get a sense of what was going on. Likewise, even in like the census, like official records, um, it's you get the feeling census takers didn't really take the Black community seriously in a way. So it's like I would go to the census. I know that the family is living in a specific community at a specific period of time. You don't find anything about them there. You almost get the feeling, oh, the census taker was like, oh, I can't be bothered to go down that lane and find those folks or something like that. So it's, but you find them like 10 years earlier in one census or 10 years later in another census, but not in a particular one. So I spent years actually researching the book, not only because I was working full time at the time that I was working on it, but also just because to try to tie up as many loose ends as I could just took a very long time. I thought of another story, actually, now, and this is sort of peripheral to Emma, but it's in the book, which is her father's brother. So he's Crawford. He was J.H. Crawford, James H. Crawford, left Pennsylvania. He attended Lincoln University when it first opened, when it was still called Ashman Institute. And then he left Pennsylvania in about 1865 to become a Presbyterian missionary as part of Reconstruction. And he went to North Carolina and he opened a number of schools, and then founded a church. And I included, even though I didn't have postcards from him, I included some of the letters. He wrote letters back from North Carolina talking about his experience with Reconstruction and starting schools and the reception that he got in North Carolina. And, interestingly, they didn't have public schools in most of the South until Reconstruction. Until then, before then, education had been private. So the students who were coming to her uncle's schools were Black and white, adults who wanted to become literate. And her uncle's letters are actually available at the National Archives, and Ancestry.com has some of them. So it was very gratifying to see his handwriting. It was almost like meeting him, and to see what he wrote about and how he wrote about it. And he was this very esteemed reverend. He actually became part of the state house, like he was a state representative during the Reconstruction era in North Carolina before Reconstruction ended and there was the backlash and they got rid of all of the Black representatives. So that story is in the book also.
And then a follow-up to the question about relatives. Did you meet more of your relatives from doing the book? And if you met more of the relatives, did they share more stories with you?
No, I did not meet more relatives. It's a good question. My mother, there's one last remaining member of the original family. My mother was the first daughter. Her youngest sister is still alive. She will be, she was born in 27, so she'll be 97 this year, and she's still lucid. She has a few physical problems, but I was trying to see if I could get more stories from her. So I've been telling her about the book. She doesn't see well enough to read it, so I've been telling her about what's in it, and then trying to sort of cross-check some of the stories with her, but I realized that there's a big difference between being the oldest girl and talking to your grandmother and getting your grandmother's stories, and then being like the baby of the family. And now the house is full of kids and you're not getting the stories. So she has actually learned from me, from the stories that I've been recounting to her and that I told her are in the book.
Hmm. And then this is someone commenting on that they recently discovered boxes of memorabilia of their great grandmother and grandmother, including postcards, and they wondered why the writing was on the front. And like you noted, and they didn't realize it was the law at the time. And they wonder if you know why it was the law at the time.
I don't. You would have to look. I don't recall why the post office reserved the back for the address. It just because there was space for writing, but I don't know why they had it that way.
And maybe it was just they were worried that the post office staff wouldn't be able to see the address if people wrote on that side, but who knows?
Something. Mm-hmm.
And then from Claudia again, how wonderful of you to come talk to us today. Fascinating and inspiring. Thank you. I have read that poor white children benefited enormously and for the first time from the schools set up by people like your relative who set up schools during Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. Yeah, it's interesting. W.E.B. Du Bois, this, master historian and sociologist, wrote a book about Reconstruction where he pointed out for so long it had such a kind of negative connotation, but in fact, it produced so many benefits. Of course, benefits to the Black population for sure, but benefits to the South in general, like public education. Just a completely new way of thinking about Southern society.
And then another comment, such an important book. The postcard collection is so interesting. Sure wish this awful part of our history didn't exist, but thank you for giving us this window into your family's history. And then I believe Robin Miller wants to make some comments. So Robin, did you want to come off mute and make some comments?
Okay, I
Robin's
wanted to
still there.
say, Faith, there's so much to love about your book and to learn. And some of the things one of the things in particular, I love the fact that you showed pictures of your family. They're so dignified and they contrast beautifully against the racist postcards. You see, this is what Black people look like and we're doing, and this is what they showed of us. So I love that. I found it frustrating to see how they had to communicate with each other and that in reality, they couldn't really share that much information about the difficulties that they were going through in a small little postcard. And also people are reading it and some people may be destroying it. So they really couldn't share and they couldn't do a back and forth and they couldn't really raise much of a family because if they all got separated and they're working at this house and that house, it sort of separated and divided the family. So there was just a lot of things that I saw, I loved, and I learned from, the closings. When people wrote at the end, they would write things like, I am your brother instead of your brother, or I am your sister in the closing. So that was unique. And I enjoyed the book. I learned a lot. You brought us to that period of time. And I thank you for that.
Thank you, Robin. And actually, you're reminding me. I remember at one point when I was just reading some of the cards over again, they're so sweet, if you know what I mean. It's what you're saying, not only are when you compare it with all the vitriol on social media today, but you
Yes.
look at the cards with the printed greetings are pleasant and welcoming, so to speak, thinking of you or whatever. And then the way people wrote, as brief as the messages were, they're affectionate and they're, just fond and it is an aspect of the Black community we don't often see portrayed, you know, the kind of just the connections between people, the way they tried so hard to keep in touch. As you were saying, they're separated because they're working all over the place and working for these different families, but you can see how much family meant to people. And
But I felt sad because you know that they were going through pain. And yes, they're not with the vitriol, but they couldn't really express themselves about the anxiety of the pain that we know they had to be going through.
Mhm.
And they
You know,
couldn't, right?
interestingly, Robin, yes, and interestingly, I do have, after I wrote the book, actually, I got some letters that
Mm,
my cousin had that were exchanges like between Emma and her brother, the one that was
mm,
traveling with the minstrel show. And they didn't even write that much about the pain. So,
mm,
which is
right.
interesting to me. And in a way, it's like you said, but it's sad because the implication to me is that they almost accepted it, you know,
Yes,
they
yes,
accepted that life is going to be hard and that they are limited in what they can do, you
right.
know, and they're going to find joy within those limitations, and they're not going to write to each other a whole lot about
Sure,
the
sure.
battles they're doing. And the letters, you know, they're just, again, very affectionate. I dreamed of you last night. I hope I get to see you again, you know, things like that.
And one more thing, I wrote down, I actually took notes, okay, when I read. And the first thing I wrote is, did you come across any letters? And you just said that because I said they couldn't share real personal feelings in postcards.
No.
And so I was wondering about the letters, but now you said from a cousin, you did get some letters and
Mm-hmm.
to understand a little bit more. Great.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. You're the reason this is happening today.
Well, I am, and then, oh, Elise, my Kathy, you're Elise. Yes.
Yes, thank you, Robin, for Robin is definitely behind this. There's one more comment here, question comment. I come out of an academic field called leisure studies. There has been some interesting research on collecting as leisure, for example, photographs, postcards, cards, tchotchkes, and what they tell us about race relations across the history of the US also
Mhm.
raises many interesting questions, issues about cultural artifacts and who owns them.
Mm,
And
mhm.
that they also say, I think your work adds so much to our thinking.
Well, thank you. And I'm not that familiar with that field, leisure studies. That is interesting. I will say I was very fortunate. This goes back to the research, but also the theme of collecting, that my grandmother was clearly a collector because I have her school books. I have some plants that she pressed, you know, way back 120 years ago. And we have the postcards. Um, we also have a lovely family album that belonged to her mother that has a bunch of, which is where some of the photographs came from that are in the book. But then there are additional photographs besides those that I'm, you know, starting to think about how I could write up some text about those photographs. So collecting, thank God for the collectors. What can we say?
And I was also thinking, and some of Robin's comments about this made me think of this, but also Faith, what you had said at the beginning, how the importance of the oral history,
Mhm.
because people don't necessarily always write down their deepest thoughts, but
Mhm.
that gets passed. That's the type of thing that does get passed down. So we need to pay attention to those and definitely not lose a chance to find out those stories
Right.
that are told that way.
And in
So,
fact, my mother, I mentioned that a big part, there was a core of this book that came from stories I heard from my mom, and she would repeat them to me, and then she would ask me to repeat them back to her. So, which makes me think that that was how she learned, that not only that's how she learned from her mother and grandmother, but that it was a very intentional kind of thing, just like you're saying, Laura. This is the history of the family. She told me, you know, the names of people first and last. And then when I started doing research on ancestry, everything bore out, you know, just as she had told me. So, you know, I think those Black families, it was like, you know, you remember your history, and just memorize it like griots and then pass it down. So I felt the book, when someone asked, how do my relatives relate? I thought, well, now I can pass it down in print. So every family member and more than the family, you know, the rest of the world can have these stories and resonate with them. And I think you said Claudia said that it resonated with her own experience. I suppose we're out of time, but I was interested in hearing more from her about that.
Claudia, can you take yourself?
It
Yes,
did.
oh, very good.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. It did, because my family, on my mother's side, came from South Carolina to Pittsburgh. And so the fact that we, first of all, talking about Pennsylvania, but also the extreme politeness, the extreme carefulness in what one writes and how one writes it, the penmanship, which is so different from nowadays. But that also resonated to me in your book. It wasn't an age of saying whatever comes into your head. Everything was very carefully set down. The other thing about your book that struck me was the heft of it, the way it was put together. It's a beautiful book. Not only the illustrations, but also the size of it, which is unusual, the weight of it, which is unusual, and the wonderful colors of the reproductions.
That's all. Thank you. The credit there goes to the University Press of Mississippi. They just, I feel like they pulled out all the stops. They just made it such a beautiful book. I burst into tears when I got my first copy, you know, because you know, I had sent it in, you know, it's like a Word document and you paste it in the photographs, you know, the postcards. But what came back, they just, they actually specialized. That's one of their specialties, is books on postcards. And I'll just say as my last thing is that my book is part of a series that is edited by Jessica Harris, whose name might be familiar to you if you've read High on the Hog or watched that series on Netflix.
Definitely.
She's a food historian, but she's also a postcard collector. And I was introduced to her through a mutual friend. When I told this friend, I have this manuscript, I'm trying to figure out if anybody would be interested in publishing it. And she said, I'm going to introduce you to Jessica. Because Jessica collects postcards. Maybe she'll have some ideas. And it kind of went from there. So it's just an interesting, you know, serendipity and connections and things like that. But I'm grateful for her series at the press.
Well, I'm grateful to you for your book.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're all so grateful that you were able to be here. I'll hold up the book again and let people know that we do have a link on our website for people to purchase the book. We'll leave that up, and and there's a special code to get a discount code that's on our website for purchasing the book. And it's not only beautiful, like Claudia said, it's beautiful, it's fascinating. And this has been an amazing talk, so interesting. We will have the talk up. We'll put it up on our website for people who missed it, or other people who might want to listen again. I might want to listen again, because so many fascinating things in this talk. And I love that final thing of it coming around on the Princeton University. That's really, really nice. So thank you so much for being here, Faith. Thank you for everyone for being here with us tonight. And we will all see you soon, I hope. And I see a comment saying, thank you so much. I hope you are working on another book. So I'm sure we'll hear about that when that comes up. So thank you all. Thank you for being here tonight, and everyone enjoy the evening. Take care to all.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.